I'm Scott Commins. I'm an associate professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I'm going to present to you a slide deck on the basics of alpha-gal allergy. Admittedly, I often call this alpha-gal syndrome, or AGS for short, and hopefully that becomes apparent over the course of these slides. So beginning with some learning objectives, the point of these slides include being able to recognize a clinical history that might be consistent with alpha-gal syndrome, equally how to diagnose AGS, recognizing the risk factors that may lead to a patient developing AGS, and discussing management options and providing appropriate diet for dietary avoidance for patients that develop alpha-gal syndrome. My disclosures include research funding, which goes to my institution from NIH, specifically NIAID, as well as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I'm on the advisory boards for Genentech and Regeneron, and I receive royalties as an author for UpToDate. As you no doubt know and are aware, it takes a village to do science, particularly these days. And I prefer to put my scientific contributors here at the start of the presentation so that these folks who have been instrumental in elucidating the alpha-gal syndrome story over the years get proper credit. So the story of alpha-gal syndrome starts really in kind of the mid-2000s. We started to hear a similar story from a few adult patients, and this was at the time in the University of Virginia Allergy Clinic in Charlottesville. And it would often start with a notion of, hey, doc, I think I might be allergic to beef. And they would say, but it's weird. The reactions don't happen right away. In fact, sometimes they wake me out of sleep. The reactions don't happen every time. Patients would say, I thought it was beef, and so I I tested it by trying another portion of beef, and nothing happened. And so I thought, well, maybe it's not beef, and then I could eat it freely, and then they reacted the third time. So the reactions were inconsistent. Equally, patients would say, sometimes it's really bad, meaning chest tightness, lightheadedness, difficulty breathing, hives, but other times they would just report some redness and itching. And then we had a few patients who said, I was so convinced that beef was an issue for me that I basically stopped eating beef and was eating more pork. And now I think I could be bothered by or allergic to pork as well. And then we had just a few patients who said, I was so convinced that I was bothered by beef and pork that I started eating more lamb, and the same thing started happening after eating lamb. And this led us to think about how we would test for a potential, meat allergy in patients. And these are some of the data from serum samples of folks who were accumulated back in 2009, and only a couple dozen folks, but the pattern was pretty consistent. They would test positive for alpha-gal, and we'll explain why that is important in the next slide. But they equally would test positive for beef, pork, and lamb. And that, I just want to spend a minute here because that hierarchy is important when you're diagnosing patients with AGS. So beef should, in fact, be higher than pork, which should, in fact, be higher than lamb. And it's not that they are more or less allergic to one or the other. It's just a nuance of those tests. The beef blood test has more alpha-gal detection capabilities, so to speak, than pork or lamb. So beef should be higher. That should be the pattern. Alpha gal should be higher than beef, but then beef, pork, lamb should go that way. Typically, these folks are negative to chicken, turkey, and fish. They will be positive for anything mammal, though. So they'll be positive for cat and dog, even though they're not necessarily bothered by their pets at all. Now, what is alpha gal? It is basically a blood group substance of lower mammals. And we have a very similar version of alpha gal in our blood group antigen B, but we have this extra fucose moiety, which is shown there in the red triangle. But alpha gal itself, and the reason it's correlated to this allergic reaction to red meat, is that alpha gal is found in all lower mammals. As humans, we and the great apes don't have alpha gal. We make an immune response to them, and the patients who go on to develop AGS make an allergic immune response to alpha gal. But the critical portion is the distribution of this. So these patients really should not be eating not only beef, pork, lamb, venison, but also rabbit, squirrel, goat, buffalo, etc. Um, we felt like the next important thing to do was to demonstrate that this allergy really did exist. And in the allergy clinic, the way you often do this is with a food challenge. So we were doing this with pork sausage, mainly because of the delay. So many patients were telling us, look, I can eat beef or pork and nothing happens for several hours, 3 to 6 hours, in fact. So we wanted to find a meat that we could use early in the morning. And that would give us the rest of the day to observe these participants to try to document their reactions to the meat challenge. So we chose pork sausage. Each patty was about 25 to 30 grams with about 10 grams of fat per patty. It turns out that the fat content is really important for triggering these reactions. So it was critical that we used a fatty meat for the challenge. We would ask patients to eat 2 to 3 pork sausage patties. And at first, we even let someone go home. This is the picture of a subject who had waited 6 hours in the allergy clinic and really didn't have much of a response. So we let him go home, and 30 minutes into the car ride home, he called us and said that his back was itching. And this is a picture of his back that was taken later, about 7.5 hours after eating pork sausage. His reaction progressed. So this is now 8 hours and 15 minutes after eating sausage. And you can see diffuse urticaria, erythema, and he noted that it was particularly itchy as well. Sometimes these reactions don't have as much full body urticaria as that other subject. So this is a participant who had more of like a lacy kind of red rash that was not as raised. And her symptoms began roughly 3 hours and 50-ish minutes after eating meat. Her symptoms started as itching, flushing, and she had significant gastrointestinal distress and ultimately required epinephrine. So the food challenges are not without their own risks. So we don't do these food challenges quite as frequently anymore, but they were an important part of establishing that the reactions are in fact delayed. I have one more slide from a food challenge to include here to point out that many patients with AGS will talk about palmar erythema and itching. And you can appreciate in this participant, unfortunately, I did cut off her palms in the pre-photo on the left, but hopefully her palmar erythema shows through on the right. This is close to 4 hours after eating pork sausage, and it's not uncommon for folks to note that palms and soles may look like this and be significantly itchy as kind of their first symptom of an allergic response in alpha-gal syndrome. Now, in terms of numbers, this is data from 2013 to 2018, really showing an increase in the number of folks who are positive per 100,000 population, and also demonstrating that the initial states where alpha-gal syndrome was described and thought to be most prevalent were those states in dark blue, kind of the mid southeastern states: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas. But you can appreciate that as the years wore on, we were starting to see reports and hear about patients up and down the East Coast and then extending into the central US as well. But this is not simply a US based allergy. So this is a website called ZMAP, ZEE, and it is basically a crowdsourced, contribute your own data type of website. Certainly, not everyone even knows about this website, so it's not an accurate representation of the number of cases, but we think it gives us a sense of where the cases are showing up generally in a geographic sense. So you can appreciate that there are cases not only throughout the US, but Australia, which was a very early site of alpha-gal related reactions, but also in Scandinavia, Central Europe, and then in South Africa as well. If we look just at the US, this is from downloaded in 2023, and you can appreciate certainly the East Coast and Central US predominance of reported, or at least crowdsourced reported cases. And this certainly is extending a little bit. And the more recent data, which were published in 2023, pick up from that prior study and now give us 2017 through December of 2022. And this is now broken out by county, showing the counties in darker blue having greater than 87 suspected cases based on positive IgE testing. So unfortunately, these are not confirmed cases in the sense that just having a positive blood test does not confirm that one has alpha-gal allergy. In fact, in many instances, we really want the performance of the blood test to be driven by clinical symptoms. It's not an ideal screening test because in many of these places where the ticks that we're going to talk about are quite prevalent, there's a high background rate of false positive testing. But this is the most current representation of where we believe testing is coming from and demonstrates positive testing in these dark blue counties. But equally, there are some interesting insights from this where there's testing coming from the Great Lakes area that probably we weren't aware of as much. Certainly, the northeastern portion of Florida has a significant amount of testing as well. We're seeing this now up into the Cape Cod region, a tremendous number of tests that are positive coming out of Long Island as well. So the distribution and recognition of alpha-gal allergy seems to be expanding across the US. Unfortunately, the provider knowledge of this really hasn't kept up with the identification of cases. So, webinars such as this through VectorWise are really important. And we know that there, based on surveys, there is a fair amount of uncertainty and lack of knowledge regarding how to manage and diagnose patients with AGS. There's two main clinical presentations, and the first of which really is more keeping with the food challenge folks that I showed earlier, where they get hives and itching and GI distress. And that's basically those kind of original, if you will, patients that came to our attention, where they really related reactions to red meat, and their symptoms were kind of the classic allergy symptoms: itching, hives, um, angioedema, even nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, hypotension. So you'd get lightheadedness, you'd get cardiovascular collapse. They would have full-blown anaphylaxis, and it tended to be really focused on red meat, particularly fatty forms of red meat. Many of them tolerate dairy, but a few don't. And typically the dairy that they don't do as well with is fattier dairy. So, ice cream, uh, a heavy cheese pizza, or even high fat whipping cream, that kind of thing. Um, More recently, we've come to be aware of patients who get gastrointestinal only symptoms. So they don't have angioedema or hives or itching. They traditionally have terrible abdominal cramping. The pain can be so profound that it takes them to the ER in the middle of the night. But they also tend to have maybe some mild nausea, occasional emesis, and significant diarrhea. In fact, uh, these folks, in a recent report, 9 of the 16 patients met criteria for diarrhea predominant IBS. So you can see their primary symptoms listed there. Most folks reported awakening at night with GI distress, and they did not report a response to every exposure, which is really in keeping with AGS. It is inconsistent. And equally, none of the patients related their gastrointestinal symptoms to eating mammalian meat before diagnosis. However, 75% recalled a tick bite. So these folks are unlikely to come into our clinics and present with, hey, I think I'm allergic to red meat. It doesn't seem to be consistent enough or happen quickly enough for them to necessarily realize that it could be triggered by beef, pork, lamb, etc. Equally, the long delay, the 3 to 6 hour delay that I described for the quote unquote original alpha gal allergic patients, seems to be a significantly shorter delay in the patients with the gastrointestinal predominant presentation. So they may be much more on kind of the 2 hour, 2 to 3 hour after eating time frame. Interestingly, the median time from symptom onset to diagnosis was almost 2 years, so a year and a half. And these do seem to be outdoorsy folks as well, and do seem to have a history of tick bites as shown there. You know, as I mentioned, I like to call this alpha-gal syndrome. And the big part of that is because for for a number of patients, their avoidance needs to go beyond just not eating mammalian meat or avoiding dairy. There can be there can be products from mammals that make their way into many of our everyday products. And this is not to say that that someone can't play drums because the drum head is made from pig skin. It's more just to raise awareness that there the derivatives of pigs and cows in particular make their way into so many of the things that we use or consume. Um, and I think we really weren't aware of this initially, and it's been a bit of a learning curve to to think about the exposures kind of beyond the meats or dairy or foods in particular. So this is a slide of general exposures. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but gelatin-based plasma expanders, which aren't really regularly used in the US, but certainly are used throughout the world, those can be a big risk for patients with alpha-gal syndrome because the gelatin is often derived from pigs or cows um, or other mammals. Many vaccines can include gelatin or other mammalian byproducts. In the US, certain MMR products have or can contain mammal products. Certain Tdap brands can contain mammalian products. There's antivenom as well. I would certainly say if someone needs antivenom, we give them antivenom, but we also just need to be aware that they could have an allergic reaction to that antivenom, not that I would withhold it. And then other products that may contain gelatin are listed here. There are certain hemostatic agents that could, even absorbable gelatin sponges. The formulation of gabapentin seems to be one that comes up not uncommonly as an issue for these patients as well. Now, how does all this start? I've told you a bit about alpha-gal syndrome, but we haven't really started to focus on ticks. And it turns out that tick bites seem to be the primary uh, causative factor for the development of alpha-gal syndrome. And in the US, we really have been focusing on Lone Star ticks, but we recognize that worldwide there are other ticks that certainly can cause AGS, so it's not limited to Lone Star ticks. Again, this is the general sense of patient-reported cases of AGS in the US, downloaded in 2023. Just to refresh your memory before showing you the distribution of the Lone Star tick, Amblyomma americanum, and you can see an expansion of the retracted approximate limit of 1945, which is the black line, now with the orange portion indicating the current or approximate limit from Dr. Little and her colleagues in 2023 publication. So significant expansion of the Lone Star tick and seems to in some ways mirror where we are now finding quote unquote new cases of alpha-gal syndrome. I think it's important to ask patients not only about tick bites, but sometimes asking them about chigger bites I find to be helpful as well. And that's mainly because the tiny ticks, the larval ticks, sometimes called seed ticks, can often appear as chigger bites. Properly, chiggers are the larval form of the harvest mite, but I think it's not uncommon for folks to refer to chigger bites as something that maybe they didn't even see. It's a small bite, but it's incredibly itchy, and you can get hundreds of them at a time, which is totally in keeping with bites from seed ticks. So I will often ask patients, have you been bitten by ticks, seed ticks, or chiggers? And I I think there is some sense that maybe chiggers are important in this, but we haven't really shown, or I haven't seen data to really scientifically establish that. I think it's just one of those terms that gets used for small bites that are itchy. So I I use it because I want patients to think about bites beyond simply an attached adult tick, which I think is often the reflex when we ask about tick bites. As we started to think about tick bites as a cause for AGS, it was really a challenge to accumulate data such as this, where you would have a patient that we saw in clinic in early July, as the example shows here, who had reactions after eating barbecue at a July 4th cookout. This patient's alpha-gal IgE was positive on July 10th, and you can see the total IgE um, around 22 or so. And then the patient contacted us in follow-up roughly a month or so, or 2 months or so later, after having tick bites from working in the garden. Larval seed ticks, lots of bites. And then we were able to track a significant rise in both the total IgE and the alpha-gal specific IgE over the weeks following those tick bites. This type of data is really difficult to come by, where you can't ask patients to go get tick bites. So accumulating enough in that scenario was going to be difficult, and ultimately led to a case control study, which I'll show you the data for in the coming slides. I wanted to make the point, though, while we're thinking about individual patients and tick bites, that in the time after a fresh set of tick bites or even a single bite, there can be a change in symptoms. So this is data from a single patient who had an alpha-gal syndrome diagnosis, and then shown here several months after the initial, sorry, several years after the initial diagnosis, had significant tick bites and had not only a rise in the alpha-gal IgE shown in blue, but also a notable increase in symptoms, particularly reactivity to dairy, which had been in the person's diet, but then with the fresh tick bites started reacting to dairy and had to remove dairy exposure due to those increasing symptoms. Then, as time goes on, the alpha-gal IgE falls and symptoms begin to return back to baseline. So not only do we see the rise in the blood testing, but patients will report that their symptoms seem to change after fresh tick bites as well. This is data from one of the Japanese groups showing alpha-gal IgE over time in response to number of new tick bites, and began to make the case that the increasing number of tick bites shown on the x-axis is correlated with the increasing alpha-gal IgE level on the y-axis. Again, a correlation didn't necessarily give us causation due to the retrospective nature of this cohort. And again, this is actually not from the US. So this is not Lone Star ticks. These are Amblyomma testinarium ticks. So we see a similar pattern even amongst varying tick species. I think the hole in the knowledge gap was really filled in 2013, when this case control study was published and essentially established the relationship between a history of a tick bite and alpha-gal syndrome. So in this study, we enrolled nearly 300 participants, roughly 100 of whom had established alpha-gal syndrome, and nearly 200 who were control patients. And as you can see on the top line, 88% of cases, those who had alpha-gal syndrome, reported a tick bite in the prior year, whereas only 47% of controls reported that, giving an odds ratio of over 11-fold. Interestingly, these were not subtle numbers of ticks. So if you look at the bottom line there, nearly 40% of the cases had 10 or more tick bites in the prior year versus only 17% of controls. So these folks are pretty heavily tick bitten in many cases. Equally, the case control study, not only did it establish the role of tick bites in AGS, but it has brought to our attention that there may be some intrinsic risk factors. So part of what we don't fully understand yet is why a certain person develops alpha-gal syndrome after tick bites when they may be hiking or farming with another individual who may or may not have tick bites and doesn't develop alpha-gal syndrome. And part of what came out in the case control study was that a history of food allergy amongst family members was higher in those folks who were case patients versus controls. And there even seemed to be a significant increase in alpha-gal allergy amongst family members of those who have AGS. So what we don't know is, does that mean there's a genetic predisposition or genetic component amongst these family members, or is it that they are hiking and farming in a similar locale and therefore getting tick bites? Maybe the tick is in fact the risk factor. So we have more to come there. The other portion that came out was the last bullet point there, that really B antigen may be somewhat protective against AGS. It's not as though there's no one. It's not a bulletproof kind of shield. It's more that they seem to be underrepresented, and we have work going on now to establish what, if any, risk factor does blood type play in AGS. Now, our current thought about the sensitization and the mechanism leading to the clinical appearance of alpha-gal syndrome is shown here, with one exception. We don't really believe anymore that the ticks have to feed on a deer or a dog or a lower mammal in order to pick up a blood meal that has alpha-gal. There is pretty good evidence, particularly from Dr. Karim's lab, that ticks seem to be able to create alpha-gal or some version of alpha-gal in their saliva. And this, not only does it unfortunately probably expand the risk, meaning more tick bites put people at risk for AGS than simply those ticks that have had a recent blood meal. But it probably makes sense evolutionarily that if the tick can express alpha-gal in some way, then when it attaches to a deer or a dog, which also have alpha-gal, the host may really not respond to the tick attached, and the tick may just sort of fly under the radar because the host sees alpha-gal and thinks that it is perhaps self. Versus when a tick that expresses alpha-gal bites a human, often patients with AGS will say, I get a red itchy spot at the site of the tick bite that lasts for weeks or months. It may be slow to heal, and it may even require antibiotics at times. So it does seem as though the ticks can almost do this on their own without a prior blood meal. And the involvement of the larval ticks, which haven't had a blood meal, I think would support that as well. But following uh, attachment to or biting a human, the the tick bite triggers the human immune response to create an IgE antibody, which is the allergic class of antibody that recognizes alpha-gal. That IgE then sits on the surface of mast cells and basophils, and it basically primes those cells to react when the person next eats beef, pork, lamb, venison, etc. And it seems as though the research is taking us toward a place where the delay in reactions is probably due to the time it takes for us to absorb fat from our foods and get those lipid molecules into the bloodstream. So it is probably the fat content of these food-based exposures that really explains the delay. I think um, some of the takeaways here would be that alpha-gal IgE is now a widely available blood test. It should be used in a confirmatory manner, not screening. And this is because in the case control study, nearly 30% of controls in a rural area in central North Carolina tested positive for alpha-gal IgE but had no symptoms whatsoever and ate red meat just fine. So we really prefer the alpha-gal IgE blood test to be used when people have symptoms that we're trying to explain and their scenario, their clinical presentation fits with a delayed allergic reaction, whether that be hives, itching, angioedema, or GI distress. We want the symptoms to guide the blood test. Um, Screening for alpha-gal IgE is certainly reasonable in at-risk patients who present with new GI symptoms. As we described, those can often be pretty substantial abdominal pain, nausea, and diarrhea. And often they will say that their GI symptoms tend to occur late in the evening. I think the other portion of this is for patients that have a positive blood test who then go on an avoidance diet, their symptoms should improve. And if they're not eating red meat, maybe they've even removed dairy from their diet. If they are still symptomatic, then it's a good chance that this is not alpha-gal syndrome because they should have some improvement. Even if it's not full 100% improvement, they should feel remarkably better on an appropriate avoidance diet if alpha-gal syndrome is the cause of their symptoms. Thirdly, patients with gastrointestinal only symptoms, they may not actually have as dangerous or life-threatening type reactions as those that I call the original type presentation. So it has largely appeared, and certainly this could change over time as we screen more people, but it has largely appeared thus far that if you have the GI version of this, that is going to be your presentation, and it doesn't seem to necessarily change between difficulty breathing and GI distress. If it has always been gastrointestinal, it probably will be GI with future exposures. I think the caveat there would be if someone has fresh tick bites, that certainly could change perhaps their clinical presentation. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But largely, if it's been gastro, it seems that at least in our hands, it's probably going to be that in the future. So I appreciate your attention and hope this has been a helpful webinar. Thank you so much.